Have you ever wondered why the story of America begins with a feast, not a massacre? Why school books show smiling pilgrims breaking bread with the Wampanoag, but not the burning of Pequot villages, or the sermons that thanked God for slaughtering heathens? Why the men who crossed the Atlantic for wealth, power, and dominion are remembered as seekers of freedom and faith? Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of one of the most enduring propaganda campaigns in world history, the rewriting of the American origin story. Because what if everything we've been taught about civilization was really about concealment? What if the first histories of this land weren't chronicles of discovery, but tools of domination? We're taught to see the colonists as founders, but they saw themselves as instruments of divine war. They didn't come to coexist. They came to conquer under the banner of righteousness. And their story, carefully crafted through sermons, diaries, and official histories, transformed conquest into providence. What if the men who claimed to build a new Jerusalem were really building the first great narrative weapon of the New World? The myth of America as a moral project didn't emerge naturally. It was engineered by those who needed to justify their crimes, to make the taking of land, lives, and futures sound like the will of heaven. The writers of early America, men like Cotton Mather, Increase Mather, and John Winthrop, weren't historians. They were myth-makers. Their mission was not truth, it was order. Their goal wasn't to record what happened, but to decide who deserved to be remembered. So tonight, we ask, how did propaganda become scripture? How did genocide become destiny? And how did the story of America become a sermon that still echoes through every classroom, every monument, and every national myth we still tell today? When John Winthrop stood aboard the Arbella in 1630, looking toward the cold, grey wilderness that would become Massachusetts Bay, he declared that his people would build a city upon a hill. The world, he said, would watch them. His words have echoed through centuries of American politics, quoted by presidents as proof of divine mission, of exceptional destiny. But Winthrop's sermon wasn't a dream of liberty. It was a commandment of control. His city was not a democracy. It was a fortress of faith, a world built on obedience and fear. The Puritans believed they were chosen, and everyone outside their covenant was condemned. Their arrival wasn't a meeting of civilizations, it was an invasion wrapped in scripture. The wilderness, they feared, was not empty land. It was the home of thriving nations, the Wampanoag, the Massachusetts, the Narragansett, people with complex languages, agriculture, trade, diplomacy, and cities. To the Puritan mind, these were not human achievements. They were evidence of Satan's deception. They saw the indigenous nations as agents of darkness, obstacles to the divine plan. The myth of a city upon a hill was never about shining light. It was about casting shadow. To remain chosen, they believed, they had to cleanse the land. That meant conversion or destruction. So from the very beginning, every sermon doubled as propaganda. The preachers spoke of divine purpose, but what they built was a moral shield for expansion. Their records and journals were carefully worded to justify the harshest actions. They portrayed indigenous resistance as unprovoked savagery, disease as God's punishment, and conquest as fulfillment of covenant. The Bible became the first weapon of American propaganda. Every verse turned into policy, every prayer into a rationalization. Winthrop and his successors created a story so powerful that it would define the nation's identity for centuries, a people chosen by God to tame a wild continent. And when later generations repeated it, they weren't just remembering history. They were rehearsing a myth born from fear, faith, and conquest. Cotton Mather was the son and grandson of power. Born in 1663, he inherited not just a pulpit, but a platform. By his lifetime, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had endured plague, famine, and bloody wars with indigenous nations. Its moral fabric was fraying, its theocracy challenged, and its purpose uncertain. Mather saw himself as a divine historian, a chronicler of God's plan for the New World, and through sheer volume, more than 400 published works, he became the single most influential writer in early colonial America. But Cotton Mather wasn't documenting truth, he was crafting legend. His massive tome, Magnalia Christi Americana, published in 1702, wasn't history, it was myth-making. In its pages, the Puritan colonists were not settlers, they were saints. Their victories in war were proof of divine favor. Their enemies, especially indigenous people, were framed as tools of Satan, obstacles to God's unfolding design. The brutal wars of the late 1600s, like King Philip's War, were recast in Mather's writing as epic battles of light versus darkness. When the colonists slaughtered entire villages, burning homes and fields, Mather described it as the Lord smiting the heathen with the sword of his people. Every massacre became a miracle, every conquest a covenant. But what's most chilling is how effective it was. His books were widely read in the colonies and even in England. They shaped how people saw themselves. They didn't just justify what had happened, they erased what could have been questioned. Mather even framed epidemics as divine cleansing. The smallpox outbreaks that devastated indigenous nations were seen not as tragedy, but as God clearing the land for the faithful. And yet, in the same breath, he claimed moral superiority and compassion. He could preach about charity on Sunday and endorse extermination by Monday. His sermons reached thousands. His words sanctified supremacy. And when the Salem witch trials erupted, Mather's theology, his obsession with purity, his paranoia of evil, fueled the hysteria. He embodied the perfect paradox of colonial propaganda, a man utterly convinced of his righteousness, blind to his cruelty. Through Cotton Mather, the blueprint of American moral propaganda was perfected. Wrap violence in virtue, crown conquest with faith, and call the result civilization. In the world of early New England, words were power. Printing presses were as mighty as armies. Every sermon, every pamphlet, every account of divine providence became a weapon in the battle for moral supremacy. By 1700, literacy rates among white colonists were among the highest in the world. The Puritans didn't just want to read, they wanted to be told what to believe. Their entire social order depended on written authority. That's what made colonial propaganda so potent. It was dressed as scripture, reinforced every Sunday from the pulpit. Cotton Mather's writings didn't circulate in isolation. They were echoed by ministers across the colonies, repeated by politicians, and reprinted by printers who understood that piety sold as well as scandal. These books became the moral infrastructure of America. They told a story that justified everything: the theft of land, the burning of villages, the enslavement of both Africans and indigenous people. Each new generation grew up reading tales of divine victory and heathen downfall. But perhaps the most dangerous thing about this literature was its tone of inevitability. It made the destruction of indigenous nations seem natural, even necessary. It turned colonization into destiny. In these pages, history wasn't recorded, it was preordained. The victims disappeared because the text demanded it. And centuries later, when early American historians wrote the first national textbooks, they relied on these same sources. Mather's words, Winthrop's sermons, and Puritan journals became the foundation for what would be called American exceptionalism. It's not an accident that our national identity still hinges on the idea of being chosen, blessed, and set apart. The earliest colonists built that ideology word by word. They didn't just conquer the land, they conquered the narrative. And once a story becomes sacred, truth has to fight to be heard. Of all the lies that colonial propaganda told, none was more catastrophic than the creation of the savage. Before contact, this continent was home to more than 500 distinct nations, each with their own histories, alliances, and technologies. There were trade routes that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, confederacies like the Haudenosaunee that rivaled European parliaments in complexity, and cities like Cahokia that once held tens of thousands. But to justify conquest, these civilizations had to be erased. The colonists didn't simply ignore indigenous humanity, they rewrote it. In their books and sermons, native people became savages, brutes, idolaters, children of the forest. The label served a purpose. It turned living nations into moral abstractions. You cannot commit genocide against savages because savages are not seen as fully human. The English borrowed this tactic from older European colonial ventures, but in America, it became foundational. Cotton Mather described native ceremonies as diabolical worship, their leaders as agents of the Prince of Darkness. Increase Mather called their resistance rebellion against divine order. And these ideas sank deep. By the 1700s, the savage had become a permanent fixture of American imagination, appearing in plays, poems, and even school primers. Every generation inherited the image, and with it, the justification for continued domination. Later, in the 1800s, as the United States expanded westward, politicians and soldiers recycled the same rhetoric almost word for word. Manifest destiny was just Puritan theology, rebranded for empire. The myth of the savage made extermination sound like enlightenment, and removal sound like progress. Propaganda doesn't die, it evolves. And the same story that once justified the Mystic Massacre would later justify Wounded Knee. The line between scripture and state policy was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. What happens when a nation builds its identity on selective memory, when its origin story is a gospel of denial? The cost is generational blindness. The colonial propaganda of the 17th century didn't just distort the past, it infected the present. By recasting genocide as divine will, early American writers made forgetting patriotic. They wrote indigenous nations out of existence, even as their descendants lived among them. They made conquest a virtue, not a crime. And because those writings became the foundation of early American education, their myths endured. To this day, we celebrate firsts that were really thefts, first harvests, first colonies, first freedoms, while ignoring the people who paid the price. Cotton Mather's version of America became so normalized that it fused with the national psyche. When presidents speak of America's manifest destiny or mission from God, they're echoing Puritan propaganda, not divine truth. And this rewriting of morality had consequences far beyond the colonies. It shaped policies of expansion, slavery, and assimilation for centuries to come. The boarding schools that sought to kill the Indian, save the man in the 19th century were simply the next chapter of a story written by men like Mather. The idea that civilization must replace savagery was the justification for cultural extermination, and it persists today in the quiet silences of our history books. When we teach children that America began with brave pilgrims instead of brutal conquerors, we continue the lie. When we celebrate Thanksgiving without mentioning the Pequot War, we echo the propaganda. The true cost of forgetting is not just ignorance, it's repetition. A nation that refuses to face its origins cannot escape its shadow. So, what do we do with this knowledge? We can't change the past, but we can change the story we tell about it. The same tools that once spread propaganda, words, print, storytelling, can also reveal truth. By revisiting the writings of men like Cotton Mather, we expose how power manipulates morality. We see how civilization was weaponized, how scripture was turned into statecraft, how genocide was baptized as destiny. But we also rediscover the voices that survived, the oral histories of indigenous nations, the documents hidden in archives, the truths whispered through generations. They are still here, waiting to be heard. History doesn't belong to the victors forever. The truth has a way of resurfacing. By confronting the propaganda that shaped America, we don't destroy its story. We free it. We replace blind pride with honest understanding, myth with memory. Because the real story of America isn't just one of conquest, it's one of resilience. The nations that the Puritans tried to erase are still here, still speaking, still reclaiming the narrative that was stolen. History was written to hide genocide. It's our job to read between the lines. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.